Hi, my name is Thomas Mical. I'm a professor at the Jindal Global University in the School of Architecture, and I've been an internationally teaching professor around a couple decades around the world in about 8 different countries.
So what is your takeaway from this year's Education Summit?
Well, I've just started the process of moving through the exhibition, but looking at the presentations, there's a clear, interesting kind of friction between the conventions and the standards in terms of what constitutes quality in education with a world that's obviously changing faster than people can keep up with it, or even faster than the technologies can keep up with it. So I think the fundamental challenge for a lot of educators is not simply working through pedagogy, but anticipating some of the intended and unintended consequences of pedagogies. And so that's where it gets quite interesting and very important for people to have a lot of curiosity about the whole process of learning in the widest possible sense.
So as you mentioned, you've actually been in the education system international as well.
Oh yeah.
And now you're back to India.
Back to India, yeah.
Any difference, or what are the two sectors divided off? What difference lies there in India?
It's in the design fields I can speak of. Design education has a lot of consistency around the world. A lot of the core principles and core design values, for example, human-centered design, are quite common from culture to culture and from even city to city. But the other thing that's quite interesting is the diversity that comes in terms of other sorts of knowledge systems that augment or supplement that. For example, there's a lot of work being done, for example, when I was in New Zealand and Australia, on indigenous and aboriginal knowledge systems and deep types of learning and new concepts of time and ecology that were influencing and impacting the way that students learn. For example, you could learn mathematics by going through a rainforest as opposed to studying from a textbook. So I think part of this process is that we have to expand our definition of how education works to take full advantage of the human capacity for curiosity. If it's not curiosity-driven education, then it becomes something quite different. And I think in the global context, what you find is everybody that studies and learns, children are inherent learners, good teachers everywhere. They all teach differently, but they all work towards the same sort of effect, which is to validate and sanction that curiosity and empower people. The Wall Street Journal famously said decades ago, they said today's students, and particularly universities, will be using technologies in 5 years that haven't been invented and working in jobs that don't exist. And so one of the things that people obviously obsess about in higher education would be future-proofing things. But also what I'm arguing is that even across the design fields, looking at different types of knowledge systems and looking at different ways of learning outside of your conventions and drawing that back into your discipline is the best way to build resilience and to make something that is more robust and sustainable as a lifelong learning process.
So going with the education system in India in particular, we can see a lot of states, they're gearing up for technological advancements. A lot has been done in the past, in the future as well they're planning to. What is your opinion of technology making a big stride in the Indian education system?
I'll use an example. About 10 years ago, business schools started teaching design and design schools started teaching business. So there was like a disciplinary envy where each side thought the other side was doing something kind of interesting. So now what you're finding increasingly is that the technologically driven fields are increasingly looking towards improving the so-called soft skills, we call them the core skills of collaboration, emotional intelligence. So what you're finding is technologically driven programs, increasingly in universities I've been working with, particularly here in India, are looking outside of those straight formal conventions of technological determinism and looking at the ways that different people can learn from each other and how to build teams and how to anticipate difficult, wicked problems. And we always say designers, for example, and this is common in India too, instead of problem solving, we have to do problem finding. So as a means of doing that, you have to have robust discussions with a variety of different types of people. So the technological is starting to influence the non-technology fields much more rapidly. In digital humanities, for example, doing 3D scannings of temples, for example, and calling out some of the forgotten cultural traditions in that process allows people to reinterpret their own history as well as to immerse themselves in the possibility of a past and a future that are somehow intersecting or co-joined. So one of the fun things that's happening in a lot of fields is that the digital and the technological has become such a baseline. Kids have tablets now, so when they come to university they expect tablet-based knowledge systems to be everywhere. And as a consequence of that, the shifts in cognitive learning styles, the Indian education system is transforming from, particularly in the secondary, the transition from secondary to tertiary is increasingly becoming less metric space is increasingly becoming more holistic as people move into universities and future professions too. So I think that the fun part of it is, world's largest democracy, a huge amount of intelligent practices here, a lot of wicked problems to work on as well in India, and there's no shortage of entrepreneurial spirit. Even in the smallest of towns, you can find that too. So it means that when we're teaching, instead of telling people this is the answer, in our context at my university, we always say, are we asking the right question? And what are 20 possible answers to that question?
So with now institutions moving apart from conventional teaching,
yeah.
A lot of competition begins in the market.
Oh yeah.
What initiatives or what different your organization is actually doing in terms of keeping ahead in the competition around it?
At the university I work with, there's a interesting balance between local scholars who have been educated internationally and international scholars like myself that come and educate there too. So what we have is the best of both worlds. We have deep knowledge, deep pockets of knowledge about Indian politics, policy, society, legal systems, economic systems. At the same time, you have this, legitimately hybridized knowledge base where people have international experiences and bring it back home too. So the context is such that even the debates, people have to speak 2, 3, 4 different languages and often have to argue from 1, 2, 3, or 4 different disciplinary positions too. So what we have is something like a Tower of Babel situation where there's just, different tongues speaking at the same time around the same issue. But the excitement of it is for students, it's enriching. They're no longer put in that monological, sage on stage model of a one-way flow of information, but increasingly put in environments where knowledge is contested, knowledge is constructed, and knowledge is something that is rhetorically articulated through a variety of different subject positions. So it makes it lively, and for the students, it's like being caught in the middle of a multi-tennis racket type of situation, which is a good learning experience too, because you're in that kind of environment. It's much easier to contribute and participate than wait to receive mastery and be ordained as an educator. Yeah?
Sure. So before I end the conversation with you, I'd like to know your opinion of, now that you've actually made your base in India in the education sector,
yeah.
What is the future you're looking forward to with your ideas and institutional gatherings all over, the competition growing as a whole? Yeah. What is your look on that?
Yeah, obviously every university is competing with each other, especially if they move up in the rankings, because there becomes the performance criteria are quite strict, so people play the system that way. At the same time, I always tell people that if you don't have any students, there's no school. So we have to keep in mind that education is about not just teaching and learning, but learning is the priority. And learning starts when you're a small child. Learning starts every time you open up a new newspaper. Learning starts every time you start a new research project. And so having research as a basis for a curiosity-driven inquiry, I think, is consistently necessary in any sort of learning environment, whether it's in the professional context, working with corporations, or working with even government ministers on different forms of design thinking, for example, or new policies. The important part to keep in mind, I think, in this context is the freedom that we have here. It is a place that, even though everyone complains about the bureaucracy, every country I've lived in, they complain about the bureaucracy. It's almost like complaining about weather. You just kind of ignore it, park it for a while and say, yeah, we know, but. And that but is actually, there's a lot of ambition here. There's a lot of experience, and there's a lot of people who are very interested in making the world a better place. And so that becomes the gathering space intellectually for a lot of these different approaches towards solving wicked problems and designing the future.
It was a pleasure meeting you. See you around. Thank you.